Well, hello there. Here is the video number 5 of the Unpacking the Birth Chart series. How will you get there is a question we're asking, and we're going to look at the hardest and softest aspects, and I am Seth Roback. How will you get there? So in the previous videos, we answered the questions: who are you? Looking at the big three, the outer four concentrations in your dominant planets. And then we asked, where are you going? So who are you? Where are you going? We'll look at the lunar north and south nodes. Now it's how will you get there? So the big picture, lunar and south nodes, are kind of the overall theme of your life. So it's hard to see in day-to-day reality. It's not something that's always in the forefront of your mind. So it's hard to see clear signs of progress. So in your day-to-day struggles are what guide us and show us how will you get there? How do you handle the struggles that you confront every day? So how will you get there? So our lives are full of struggles. But we also have natural talents, strengths, and graces that help us through those struggles. The struggles are represented in astrology charts by our hard aspects and placements. And our graces, the things that and talents and strengths, are represented by our soft aspects and placements. So if you're unfamiliar with aspects and placements in general, you can watch my video for my beginner astrology curriculum, Astrology 102, Planet Signs and Aspects, that get into, sign placements and then aspects, and then Astrology 103, Angles and Houses, that have to do with house placements of planets. So we'll look at the hard aspects when we answer how will you get there. And of course, as we know, the hard aspects are the challenges that we face in each day. And those are squares, oppositions, inconjuncts, otherwise known as quincunxes, and conjunctions with hard planets such as Saturn and Mars. Hard sign placements are in their fall or detriment. So, for example, take, for example, your sun sign. Sun is exalted in Aries, so its fall would be on the opposite side, which would be Libra. And its rulership is in Leo, so the detriment would be on the opposite side in Aquarius. So it's good to become familiar with what we call the sign dignities that show, the rulership, exaltation, falls, and detriments. Which signs, are the strongest placements for the planets, which signs are the weakest, are the hardest ones. So hard house placements for the planets are in the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses, meaning that they're, the 8th and not meaning that they're always bad or difficult, but they tend to be challenging, particularly the 8th and 12th, because they're somewhat mystifying and mysterious. The 12th house dealing with the collective unconscious, or with our subconscious mind, is kind of oftentimes forcing us to turn our detaching from the regular physical world and going into spiritual introspection. And the 8th house is about transformation, often can deal with crises. 6th house can be health, struggles, those sort of things. So those tend to be harder house placements. So now let's look at the soft aspects. And the soft aspects are trines, sextiles, quintiles. That includes the biquintile, and conjunctions with soft planets such as Jupiter and Venus. So when we look at soft sign placements, that's planets that are in their exaltation or rulership. So again, being familiar with the planetary and sign dignities, take for example, something like Mars is exalted in Capricorn, and it's in its rulership in Aries. So soft house placements are in the angular houses, which are the first, fourth, seventh, and 10th house, and what are considered the more luckier houses, where there tends to be more good fortune, are the 5th and 9th houses. And then there's a bunch of neutral kind of houses like, second and third and the 11th. So it's, not considered soft or hard. So anyways, becoming familiar with those placements. So hardest and softest aspects. Let's look at how do you figure out what are the hardest and softest aspects. So those are the aspects that are the major aspects, in terms of the major soft aspects are the trines, and the major hard aspects are the squares. So we tend to emphasize those over, let's say, sextiles. That would be a minor soft aspect, and a minor hard aspect would be an opposition. Now they can, so you tend to look at the major aspects over the minor ones when you want to figure out what are the hardest and softest. And then you also want to look at the tightest orbs, which, if you look here, I in this grid with the planets showing the aspects, I circled or squared the ones with the major aspects, the squares and trine. These are, and then I also looked at the tightest orbs. So the number that's there in those boxes show the orb. That means the distance between what deviation the planets are from their aspects. So a square is 90 degrees. So if one of the planets is 2 degrees off of 90, it would have either a -2 or a 2. That would be there. So it shows how far it deviates off of the degree of the aspect. So so 0 to 3 degrees is considered a tight aspect. 4 to 6 degrees is about medium, and then 7 to 10 degrees is pretty loose. And obviously the tighter the orb, the stronger the aspect. So I circled here, this is my grid here. I circled the, I'll just highlight it in, let's see. So right here is a trine that has 2 degrees, and it's between Mercury and Jupiter. So I have a tight trine there, and then I have a tight square here that's -2 degrees of the Sun and Uranus, and then a 1 degree square here of Venus and Pluto. So my softest aspect would be that trine, and then I have 2 pretty tight hard aspects there of of 2 squares. So anyways, looking at house ruler, so one thing that you can do to get specific, precise information about an aspect is to look at the house rulerships and placements. So what we're looking at here are, the tightest aspects that I have in my chart, which I just showed in the grid in the previous slide. So House rulerships and placements of planets give more concrete details. They identify exactly how hardest and softest aspects manifest in your day-to-day life. So let's just take one of my hard aspects. Let's look at the Venus here that's squared Pluto. So Venus is in Gemini, and it's in the 7th house of relationships. Pluto is in the 10th house of career in Virgo, both mutable signs, right? So now we want to look at their rulerships. And so Venus rules the 6th house, because let's see here. The 6th house cusp is in Taurus, and Venus rules Taurus. And then it also rules the 11th house, because the 11th house cusp is in Libra, which is ruled by Venus. So Venus here affects the 11th house of friendships and community, as well as the 6th house of health and day-to-day routines, service, work, service to others. So that's squared. That's squared to Pluto. Pluto, which is, let's look at here, Pluto, which rules my 12th house. So Pluto here rules the 12th house, which is the subconscious. So here you see, okay, so when you put it all together, it kind of tells a story. I mean, a more complex story. That's why it's good to focus on your hardest or your most potent aspects, because there's so much information just in one aspect. There's so many things you can talk about, you know. And so what this shows here is that Pluto, which is in the 10th house, having to do with career, rules the 12th house. So the 12th house ruler of the subconscious, of the mind, is in the 10th house, which, you know, has a lot to do with perhaps psychology, you know, career of working somehow with the mind, with, you know, my spiritual work that I do, you know, doing astrology charts and that sort of thing. But it is squared Venus, which rules my 6th and 11th house. So having to do with health and friendships, community, you know, Venus is relationships. So it shows that there's this challenging aspect of wanting to create transformation through relationships, healing, that sort of thing. But it's healing that comes from a sense of internal pain and struggle that I struggle with myself, you know, dealing with relationships. When you put Venus and Pluto together, it has oftentimes to do with, you know, difficult relationships, you know, and so, you know, through my astrology, through my healing, you know, it comes from a lot of internal struggle that I've had throughout my life of trying to, you know, understand these things. And so, you know, that's just taking one aspect. You know, and so I'm just looking at the other aspect that I have. Well, let's look at let's look at my trine. So my trine is Jupiter trine Mercury, which, you know, Mercury and Jupiter have to do with knowledge and communication, teaching, those sort of things. So those are trines. So that's a soft aspect that I have. And Mercury rules my 7th house, because the 7th house cusp is in Gemini, which is ruled by Mercury. And then it also rules Virgo, so career, which is funny because that's also what was kind of, you know, Venus and Pluto are in those houses, and Mercury rules those houses. So they're all kind of relate to each other. So you see how it puts together this intricate, complex story just within those few aspects. So, you know, Mercury's in Cancer. So Mercury takes expression through the emotions. You know, my intellect is governed by the moon, which is emotions and psychology and that sort of thing. So, and then Jupiter is my chart ruler, you know, because well, let's see, why did I put a thing there? Okay, so, because Jupiter rules Sagittarius, so this is my identity, who I am. And what it shows here is that, you know, the ability to, that there's this ability to communicate through relationships in career, and that it has a positive relationship with my philosophical nature, you know, and so Mercury is sextile that. So you can see how the struggle I have with relationships with the Venus and Pluto square, and how they rule, you know, health and friendships, and, you know, I didn't, you know, and Pluto rules the subconscious. So there's a struggle there, but there's also a gift there. So when you know, which clearly defines who I am. And so that tells a more intricate story. And then also I have a square with the sun that's in Cancer in the 8th house, and Uranus, which is in the 10th house in Libra. So when you put the sun and Uranus together, that oftentimes has to do with creativity, but also of being misunderstood and somewhat eccentric, which obviously, you know, going into astrology and, you know, especially in our Western society is not easily accepted. You know, so it's hard to communicate sometimes, those sort of things. But let's look at what the sun rules. The sun rules the 9th house cusp, which is in Leo. So Leo is here, it rules the sun. And then Uranus rules the 3rd house cusp, because that's Aquarius. That's in Aquarius, right? So let's see. So that's Aquarius right there. So the 3rd house is in the 10th house, communication. The 9th house is philosophy and teaching, which is in the 8th house of transformation, survival instincts. So, you know, I'm very much in touch with our primordial natures, you know, our lower animal natures that transform us into our higher spiritual nature, you know, and so that's my sun sign. I shine light into that. It's also how I come across is somewhat, you know, somewhat mysterious, maybe secretive, I don't know. But I'm also a, you know, philosophical and a teacher, but it's, you know, so it's kind of a funny contrast and dualism there. And then it's squared to Uranus, you know, which rules the 3rd house. So communication and knowledge and that sort of thing. And it's in Libra, which is relationships. So they all kind of tie together, you know, my trines in those 2 squares. And so when you take those squares and you put the trines together and you present that to your client, it's going to hit them like a ton of bricks. Like it'll be a super aha moment for them. it's hard sharing my own because it's not, maybe you're not, you don't relate to it yourself. But when you do that for someone else and you present their chart and you take the most potent aspects they have and then describe them with this kind of more, using the rulerships and the placements and putting it all together. You don't want, you notice how I cleared out all these other aspects out of the chart to just focus on the hardest one, the most hardest and the softest ones. It will be very pithy. I think you'll find it'll really resonate and have a certain potency that will be very relatable to the person you're describing, and just in showing their struggles and the things that, and how they overcome those struggles. So anyways, now I wanted to look at like bigger, oftentimes you have what are called aspect patterns. So when you deal with aspects, it's the relationship between two planets. But aspect patterns are when you're looking at a bunch of planets that form geometric shapes. And, and I think they can, and you'll run into these. And oftentimes when I'm doing a chart reading, I'll point out the aspect patterns. Now, some of these aspects might be very loose, loose orbits. So it's not focusing necessarily on the tightest orbits, the tightest aspects, but some might be tight, some might be loose, but they form a geometric pattern. And I think in those geometric patterns can be very revealing. Now, what we have here is called a grand cross or grand square. I'm looking at the chart of Barney Hill, who was a famous UFO abductee, one of the first ones. And I just happen to have him in my database. It's not that I picked him for a particular reason, but he has what's called a grand cross between his moon, his Uranus, his Mars, and his Venus. And notice that they're all immutable signs. So when you have a grand square or grand cross, oftentimes they'll be all in the same mode. Now, sometimes, they'll be on the, they'll be close to a cusp between two different signs. And so in that case, you might have a planet that's in not the same mode but a bordering sign, if that makes sense. But if they're in the middle of, if they're all kind of in the middle of the sign, like this case, they'll all be in the same sign. So this forms a grand cross, and often this can represent, a transformative struggle, in which this, in being mutable, you feel like you're constantly adapting to change, and obviously being a UFO abductee is a pretty major shift in your life. So, it had an impact on him psychologically, sexually. So you could see there's like there's a square between Venus and Mars, which oftentimes have to do with sexuality, kind of a fear around that. Uranus has to do with, can very much be about aliens or UFOs or some, something that comes out of left field, Uranian, change, surprises, that sort of thing can come out of Uranus. And then the moon is emotions. And so there's this, intense struggle or stress around these planets, but that this can be very transformative, in helping a person to really make huge strides in their life. So looking at another common aspect pattern, this is more common than the grand cross or grand square, is a T-square, which, usually you have one planet that's at the triangle or at the tip of it. There's two planets that are in opposition of each other, and then one planet that mediates. So the planets in opposition here are Mercury and Jupiter, and then Neptune's in the middle here. And this is Barack Obama's chart, the US president. So the top of the T-square mediates the conflict between the oppositions. So Neptune here in the ninth house is in opposition between Mercury and Jupiter, which, has to do with teaching. Barack Obama was a law school teacher, but also there was Neptune, and he was a constitutional, taught classes about the U.S. Constitution. But then the Neptune is about being receptive to bigger forces. And Scorpio gives kind of, power, being receptive to control, being a president. He had his ideals when he went into the presidency, but he was influenced by economic powers and other things that had him compromise those ideals, or forced him to compromise those ideals. So then now we're looking at a grand trine, which is when you have, oftentimes you'll have, let's look at the sun here. Sun is between the sun, Pluto. This is Timothy Leary, the psychologist, writer, and guru of the psychedelic movement of the counterculture in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. So, and then he has this moon Uranus conjunct. So there's this trine. Now notice here, sun's on the cusp of Libra and of Scorpio. So here's an example. Now usually when you have a trines, all the planets are in one element, every single sign in the element, but in this case his sun is on the cusp of Scorpio and Libra, whereas Pluto is in Cancer, and here he has moon in Aquarius. So the sun in Libra is in the same element as moon in Aquarius, but Pluto, so it's a loose trine to Pluto, which is not on the cusp, kind of close to the cusp of Gemini. So so Pluto is a very loose aspect, but whereas the sun and moon are a tighter aspect. But when you get a grand trine like this, there's tremendous ease that happens, but it can also lead sometimes to complacency. Usually a trine is a talent, but this is, a talent. But I don't know. I don't know if he, in his case, if it led to complacency. His moon and Uranus, made him take an alternative, innovative approach to emotions. And moon is also in Aquarius, that is ruled by Uranus. And so then it's in Pluto, which is transformation, death and rebirth. And then also the sun, which has to do with self-expression. So, he obviously gained a lot of fame through the counterculture movement, and you can see this through the trine. So now we'll look at another common one that's called a sextile hat, that I call a sextile hat. It's usually a sextile between three planets, which are Uranus and Mercury, and Saturn and Mercury. Both of those are sextiles, but Uranus and Saturn have a trine between each other. So again, this is also a very easy aspect. Mercury kind of mediates between the trine of Uranus and Saturn. So this was Mary Sherman, who was an orthopedic surgeon and cancer researcher. And so she has a sextile trine with this Mercury. So incredible intellectual abilities, but also very innovative with the Saturn-Uranus trine, that has to do with coming up with new ideas, new structures, new orders. Another one you hear about that's not as common because you have to have, a grand trine in a sextile hat, which are not common together. You get what's called a kite. This is Kurt Cobain's chart. And this has so much ease. He rose to fame very young as a rock star. And so it was almost too much, too much fame, too much in the limelight, and it was tragic what happened to him, that he committed suicide. But he was famous as a rock star, and he had that Uranus-Pluto conjunct, right in his Walkland sector, right near the first house. So he embodied the revolutionary ideals of the mid-60s. He was that embodiment that came through his artwork with Venus and became a cultural icon with Jupiter. And then he had this tremendous visionary ability through his lyrics, which came through Neptune, and so it almost made him rise too fast to fame, which could have been damaging. So, and then this last aspect pattern I want to talk about is what's called a yod. And this is the chart of Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, who actually did research with astrology and, combined it with Jungian psychology. And so at the yod has two inconjuncts, which are the green lines that make that Pluto is at what a yod stands for is the finger of God. And so you have these two inconjuncts, Pluto that's conjunct the moon, he was, which has to do a lot with psychology and transformation. And then Jupiter, which made him a teacher, and Mars, he studied our primitive he followed in the footsteps of Freud, and I think of Mars as sort of the id, Jupiter is sort of the super ego, and then in the middle of it is Pluto and the moon, which is, transformation of emotions. But okay, so with the yod, you have two inconjuncts and then a sextile. So you have inconjuncts with the moon Pluto conjunct with Jupiter, and the moon Pluto in conjunct with Mars, and then Mars and Jupiter have a sextile between them. So the way a yod is, an inconjunct by itself often is a aspect that creates a certain level of oddness or confusion, and when of a certain awkwardness between the two planets. So when you think about Jung, he was sort of an outcast. He was very much an outcast in the scientific community, and he didn't fit in the religious community. So he really didn't fit in either world, which is kind of Jupiter representing cultural values and the cultural norms. That he was kind of an outcast of that. But being an outcast, he found his way, he found his voice. And the yod, the finger of God, is a Jewish term of the finger of God leading the Jews to the promised land. And they wandered 40 years in the desert, originally fleeing from slavery and from the Egyptians, but just kind of this feeling of lost, and then but having to have faith, having to believe in their vision. And I see that as people who have yads, have had to struggle with the feeling of searching for a homeland, who are lost, who are trying to find their way, but they find something greater. And Jung is this brilliant psychoanalyst who didn't fit in any of the communities that he was a part of, but because of that, we have he created something new, something that needed to be discovered, which was a lot of his research into the collective unconscious, into archetypal psychology, his studies on astrology. He gave legitimacy to astrology and described it as, using the laws of synchronicity, that symbols, that the symbolism in our world, whether we, happens in our dreams or on an astrology chart or reading tea leaves or whatever it is, that they're all synchronized together through this mysterious force, and obviously saying these sort of things lost him respect with the materialistic scientific approach of Freud and of his peers. So, it's a very powerful aspect pattern, the yod. So what are our takeaways here? We're answering the question, how will you get there, the hardest and softest aspects. So, we're approaching this, that it's hard to see where you're going all the time with your lunar nodes. And so the hard aspects are the struggles in life that we encounter every day that define us. And the soft aspects are those graces that help us to deal with those struggles, those hard aspects. So those are the things that are tangible. That's, boots on the ground, crossing the landscape, the terrain of our life each day, going towards the goal of our lunar nodes. So the next question we're going to ask in the next video is, where are you now? And so we will show how the Saturn returns and the transits trigger these aspects. So, and that will be the final question that we answer when we do a chart reading. So I appreciate you listening, and I'm excited to share with you the next video that answers, where are you now?